April 18, 1942. The North Pacific wind cut across the flight deck of USS Hornet like a blade. Waves slammed against the hull, sending sprays of cold salt water over the tied-down bombers. 16B, 25 Mitchells, far larger than anything a carrier had ever tried to launch. Their propellers turned slowly, grumbling against the morning air, warming for a takeoff that had never been attempted in the history of aviation. Off the bow, visibility was low. Gray skies, rising swells, a distant threat hidden beyond the horizon. On the bridge, Admiral William Halsey studied the reports. Japanese picket boats had spotted the task force. Surprise was gone. The plan was compromised. Below, crews fastened their gear in silence. Some folded letters they would never send. Others stared at the churning ocean that waited for them after their fuel ran out. None expected to return home. At 8:20, the carrier turned into the wind. The deck heaved upward. Colonel James H. Doolittle stepped forward into the open air. The moment of decision had arrived. And as the first bomber inched toward the painted white line, the story of how this raid emerged from the darkest months of the war began long before this moment. In the months following Pearl Harbor, the Pacific Ocean felt immeasurably wide. The United States Navy, once confident and sprawling, now seemed wounded and scattered. Battleships lay on the shallow bottom of Pearl Harbor's harbor floor, their silhouettes visible through oil-stained water. The Japanese Empire moved with stunning speed, seizing Hong Kong, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines in a series of victories that seemed unstoppable. Morale in America was brittle. Newspapers spoke of a war that would be long, painful, and unclear. Families along the West Coast turned their eyes to the Pacific, wondering if the war might soon touch their shores. For the first time in modern history, the American public felt vulnerable. President Franklin D. Roosevelt knew the United States needed more than speeches or promises. The country needed a symbol, something sharp enough to cut through despair. A strike on Japan itself, even a small one, would send a message the world could not ignore. But the idea seemed impossible. The Pacific distances were too great. The U.S. had no bases close enough to launch heavy bombers. And yet the proposal took shape quietly. In the mind of Navy Captain Francis Lowe, Army bombers launched from an aircraft carrier. The notion was so unconventional that it bordered on reckless. No one had ever flown medium bombers from a carrier deck. Their wingspan was too wide, their weight too heavy, their takeoff speed too high. But impossibility was a luxury the United States could no longer afford. The plan, if it worked, would strike Tokyo, a city Japanese leaders believed to be beyond reach. Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle, aviator, engineer, and one of the nation's most daring test pilots, stepped forward to lead the mission. His reputation for solving the impossible made him the natural choice. Doolittle had broken air records, pioneered instrument flying, and understood machinery in a way few men alive did. But even he knew the odds were grim. He later admitted that he expected to be court-martialed if the mission failed. The concept required immediate secrecy. Volunteers from the Army Air Forces were told only that they would be part of a special, extremely dangerous mission. Training began at Eglin Field in Florida, where experienced bomber crews learned to take off in less than 500 feet, a tiny margin compared to conventional airstrips. Pilots practiced over and over until their wheels left the ground at the edge of painted white lines, simulating a carrier's deck. They removed guns, added custom fuel tanks, stripped weight, and memorized fuel calculations. Every minute of range mattered. They were not expected to return to the carrier. Instead, they would fly west after the attack, aiming for landing zones in free Chinese territory. The idea was not to survive the ocean, but to escape overland. Meanwhile, Japan continued to expand. Singapore fell in February 1942. The last American defenses in the Philippines were collapsing. Tokyo's confidence grew stronger with each victory. Japanese leadership viewed the United States as psychologically weakened and militarily unprepared for a long war. They believed the American fleet would take years to recover, years Japan intended to use to fortify its new empire. Yet behind closed doors in Washington, the pieces of the counterstrike were aligning. USS Hornet was selected to carry the bombers. USS Enterprise, with Admiral Halsey aboard, would provide escort and cover. The operation had a name, Task Force 16, and a mission so bold it seemed almost symbolic more than strategic. As March turned into April, the crews boarded the Hornet, watching their B-25s crane lifted onto the deck, their olive-drab wings stretching out over the restless sea. They sailed north, deep into the cold Pacific, following a route chosen specifically because it was lightly patrolled. The ocean felt endless. Every mile carried them closer to Japanese waters. But the real significance of the operation, the part that would shake Japanese leaders to their core, stemmed not from the moment of takeoff, but from the rising pressure behind it. Pressure built by months of defeat and a nation desperate to show it was far from beaten. And it's in understanding this escalating tension that the next layer of the story emerges, the strategic landscape Japan believed it controlled. Japan entered 1942 with a confidence that bordered on conviction. Its war planners believed they had engineered a window of dominance, a period in which America's Pacific Fleet lay crippled and its supplies stretched thin. Their calculations rested on a simple assumption: the United States, hundreds of miles away across the ocean, lacked the means to carry the fight to the Japanese homeland. Tokyo was considered untouchable. Even senior members of the Imperial General Headquarters doubted America had the psychological will to strike back so soon after losing so much. But not all Japanese leaders shared this certainty. Admiral Isuke Yamamoto, architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor, understood the industrial might of the United States. Having studied in America, he knew its factories, its workforce, and its national temperament. He warned that Japan had awakened a sleeping giant, a phrase often linked to him after the war, though its sentiment reflects his genuine concerns. Yamamoto believed that early victories were only temporary. Unless he destroyed America's aircraft carriers quickly, the war could turn. Still, even he did not believe U.S. bombers could strike Japan in early 1942. The distances alone made such an attack seem implausible. Japan focused instead on fortifying its perimeter, extending defensive rings across the Pacific, and preparing for inevitable clashes in the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Indian Ocean. As Task Force 16 pressed westward, the two American carriers, Hornet and Enterprise, operated under strict silence. Their position was known only to a handful of commanders in Washington. Every hour brought them deeper into enemy-controlled waters. Lookouts scanned the horizon for fishing boats or picket vessels that might reveal their presence. The closer they drew to Japan, the more dangerous the mission became. The crews on board lived in a strange balance between routine and dread. Pilots studied maps of Japan, tracing routes toward industrial districts, docks, rail yards, and military installations. Navigators reviewed winds, cloud cover, and escape paths toward China. Mechanics checked fuel tanks, motors, and bomb racks repeatedly. Every man understood the fragility of the plan. If discovered too soon, they risked losing the carriers, the last operational striking power the U.S. possessed in the Pacific. Japanese intelligence, meanwhile, monitored U.S. movements but assumed no American task force would venture deep into the North Pacific. Their focus remained fixed on the Coral Sea and the Indian Ocean, where they expected larger battles to unfold. Home defense units, confident in their protective buffer of ocean, trained for potential air raids but considered them highly unlikely. This strategic oversight would become one of the most important miscalculations of the war. Back aboard Hornet, Doolittle met with his men in cramped ready rooms. He outlined their targets with clinical precision but reminded them that survival was uncertain. Some crews packed extra rations. Others took only what they needed to lighten the aircraft. Most carried a single hope: to land in Chinese territory after the mission, away from Japanese control zones. Yet the risk of forced crashes loomed large. There was no turning back to the carrier. Once airborne, they were committed to a one-way journey. As the task force approached launch distance, the weather shifted. Swells grew larger. Temperatures dropped. The gray sky seemed to press down on the ships like a weight. Daylight was limited, and each mile carried the risk of enemy detection. The plan called for the bombers to launch roughly 400 to 450 miles from Japan. They would reach their targets around midday, strike with precision, then continue westward. Every detail had been rehearsed on land, but rehearsals could not replicate the risks of an early encounter with picket boats or patrol aircraft. The tension built quietly, hour by hour, as the task force pushed forward. And within this tightening band of danger, the story shifts toward the many angles that shaped the raid: the human courage, the tactical gamble, the technological improvisation, and the Japanese miscalculations that set the stage for the shock that was coming. For the men chosen for the raid, the mission existed in a rare place between honor and inevitability. They were volunteers, but many admitted later that they didn't fully understand what they were stepping into. When their B-25s were rolled onto the deck of Hornet, the truth settled in. This was a mission designed without a return path. Most of the crews were in their early 20s. Some had never sailed on a carrier before. Others had never flown over an ocean. In quiet moments, they wrote letters home or stared at the endless Pacific, knowing that fuel limits made survival uncertain. In the small, dim compartments below deck, they spoke softly about home, rationed jokes to cut the tension, and tried to imagine what Tokyo looked like from the air. Yet none expressed regret. Doolittle himself carried a calm intensity. He spoke little about fear. His focus was efficiency, fuel loads, weight limits, wind direction. But privately, he understood the stakes. If the raid failed, morale at home would sink deeper, and his own career, the legacy he built as an aviation pioneer, might collapse with it. Still, every crewman accepted the risk. They were not launching to win a battle. They were launching to restore belief. And as these men prepared for a one-way mission, another angle defined the operation's dangerous precision: the tactical gamble that made it possible. Launching medium bombers from a carrier was not just unconventional. It bordered on tactical defiance. Every factor worked against success. The B-25 Mitchell needed far more runway than the Hornet could offer. Crosswinds, deck pitch, or a brief engine hesitation could doom a plane before it cleared the bow. And once airborne, the crews would navigate with limited visibility, low altitude, and the constant risk of interception. Yet the plan was not reckless. It was built on a sequence of precise adjustments. Engineers modified each bomber by stripping unnecessary weight, removing turrets, reducing ammunition, adding rubber fuel tanks, and calibrating engines for maximum range. Pilots trained to push their aircraft to the edge of aerodynamic limits, lifting off at speeds typically reserved for emergencies. The Navy's tactical component was equally delicate. 2 carriers and their escorts had to penetrate waters monitored by Japanese patrols. Radio silence was absolute. The fleet altered course frequently to avoid known picket lines. The margin for error was razor thin. Being spotted too early meant the carriers might be attacked, the mission aborted, or worse, both task force and bombers lost. Every mile closer to Japan tightened the tactical wire they walked. But even this gamble was influenced by an angle often overlooked: the Japanese strategic mindset that assumed the impossible could not happen. On the eve of the raid, Japanese confidence was at its peak. Their early war victories had fostered a belief that their defensive perimeter was impenetrable. Tokyo had civil defense drills, but these were considered precautionary formalities rather than preparations for a real threat. Few expected enemy aircraft to appear over the capital. This confidence grew from Japan's reading of American capabilities. They believed the United States lacked forward bases and had no aircraft capable of reaching Japan from the Pacific. Japanese intelligence monitored carrier movements, but their analysts assumed no U.S. admiral would risk a deep strike so close to Japan's heartland. This overconfidence left gaps. Picket boats were scattered but not coordinated. Radar networks were developing but incomplete. Early warning procedures were more theoretical than practiced. Even Yamamoto, who respected American ingenuity, believed any attack would be months, if not years, away. Thus, when foreign aircraft appeared over Tokyo's sky, it wasn't just a breach of airspace. It was a shattering of the belief that distance itself was Japan's shield. And understanding these three angles sets the stage for the next. The technological innovation, naval risk, and moral psychology that drove the raid forward. The B-25 Mitchell was never designed for carrier operations. Yet necessity, in war, reshapes what machines can do. For the Doolittle Raid, technicians approached the aircraft like surgeons preparing a patient for an operation. Weight was the enemy. Every unnecessary pound was removed. The lower gun turret was taken out entirely. The Norden bomb sight, too sensitive for ocean moisture and too valuable to risk capture, was replaced with a simple improvised device, a metal plate with pre-calculated angles known as the Mark Twain sight. The aircraft received extra fuel tanks in the bomb bay, crawl space, and even beneath the floor. This turned each bomber into a flying fuel reservoir, carrying up to 1,141 gallons, enough to reach Japan and drift toward China. Pilots trained to push engines to full power while holding the aircraft at the edge of stall speed, a maneuver that demanded perfect control. Missing the correct moment to lift meant either a catastrophic drop or the aircraft smashing into the sea. On the carrier, the aircraft were angled precisely, their tires chalked to the deck, their propellers synchronized. A strong headwind would be their only advantage. It was a technological improvisation at the edge of feasibility, and a reminder that innovation often emerges from desperation. But technology alone could not complete the mission. The naval gamble beneath, it was equally profound. The U.S. Navy entered April 1942 with a rare concentration of its surviving carrier strength. Hornet and Enterprise sailing together was an enormous risk. Had they been found and attacked by a Japanese surface group or long-range bombers, the Pacific Fleet might have lost its last offensive capability. For the task force, the ocean was a vast arena of uncertainty. Japanese submarines prowled the waters near the home islands. Picket boats created a loose outer ring of warning craft. Every sighting, every radio transmission, every shadow on the horizon mattered. Radar was limited. Visibility dictated survival. Halsey's orders were clear: protect the carriers at all costs, but launch the mission as soon as conditions allowed. The fleet advanced with caution, zigzagging through cold northern waters, often in rough seas that made flight deck work dangerous. The commanders knew that if they were discovered, they might have to launch early, perhaps too early, jeopardizing the ability of the bombers to reach China. Below decks, sailors whispered about the stakes. The loss of 2 American carriers would shift the Pacific balance dramatically. Yet the ships pushed forward, willing to risk everything to deliver 16 aircraft close enough to touch the Japanese mainland. And beneath all of this, the technology, the naval strategy, the human courage, lay an even deeper force: the psychological weight of revenge. The Doolittle Raid was not designed to cripple Japan's war machine. It was designed to strike at something deeper, the spirit of a nation reeling from humiliation. After Pearl Harbor, the American public felt exposed and wounded. Newsreels showed burning battleships and fallen sailors. Cities practiced blackout drills. Rumors spread a possible invasion along the West Coast. A successful raid on Japan, even a symbolic one, would show that the United States was not defeated. It was awakening. For the Japanese leadership, the psychological dimensions were equally significant. Their early war victories led to a belief in invulnerability. The raid would puncture that belief in a way no diplomatic warning or intercepted message ever could. The crews understood this. When they trained on short runways and memorized fuel charts, they were preparing not just for a mission, but for a message. Their flight would prove to Japan and to the world that America could cross the ocean and strike back. And with each angle converging, the human, tactical, technological, naval, and psychological, the moment approached when planning would shift into action and the raid would unfold in real time. April 18, 1942. Dawn broke over the northern Pacific with gray clouds and rolling swells. The USS Hornet pitched in the waves, its 16B-25 Mitchell bombers tied to the deck like sleeping predators waiting for release. The crews had rehearsed the takeoff countless times on land, but nothing could replicate the heaving, moving deck of a carrier in open waters. At 6:30, the first Japanese picket boat appeared on the horizon, small, wooden, and unarmed against the steel leviathans of Task Force 16. Yet its presence was enough. Radio intercepts confirmed it would report the carrier's position. Halsey had only seconds to decide, abort or launch early. Doolittle ordered the mission to proceed. There was no margin for delay. Every pilot knew that taking off from a moving carrier was a calculated gamble at the edge of physics. Wind speed, deck angle, and weight distribution all mattered. The first bomber, piloted by Lieutenant Ted Lawson, raced down the short deck. Engines roared, wheels spinning on the painted white line. At the last possible moment, the aircraft lifted into the gray sky, teetering between stall and flight. One by one, the others followed, 16 men and their planes becoming a long streak of olive green against steel blue waves. The deck emptied. The carriers were defenseless for the briefest moment, yet the mission had begun. The flight toward Japan stretched hundreds of miles across hostile skies. Clouds cloaked the bombers in silence. Pilots monitored fuel gauges obsessively. Any miscalculation meant a forced landing over open ocean or enemy territory. They had been trained for navigation, for bombing runs, for emergency landings, but nothing could fully prepare them for what awaited over Japan itself. By mid-morning, the lead aircraft neared the coast. Tokyo, Yokosuka, Yokohama, cities considered untouchable, lay below. Lawson's plane reached the target first. From 7,000 feet, the cityscape unfolded. Docks filled with ships, factories belching smoke, rail yards bustling. Bombs were released with careful precision. Blasts shook streets, surprised civilians fled, and the shock rippled across a nation unprepared for conflict at home. Following bombers struck targets in Kobe, Nagoya, and Yokohama. Smoke and fire rose from industrial districts. Japanese anti-aircraft guns responded, but few rounds reached the high-speed, low-altitude bombers. Confusion spread in command centers. Reports came in, American bombers were over the home islands, and no carrier was nearby. Panic and disbelief replaced the morning calm. For the aviators, the raid was both exhilarating and terrifying. Clouds of smoke and fire mixed with the exhaust and engine hums. Eyes scanned for Japanese fighters. Zeros had been dispatched, but the raiders' low altitude and speed gave them fleeting advantage. The knowledge that fuel was limited added a layer of tension that nothing could erase. Some crews flew on fumes, pushing engines to limits that had been rehearsed only in simulations. Yet the human element persisted amidst the chaos. Pilots thought of home, of families, of letters never sent. Mechanics silently cheered from the deck as distant flashes confirmed bombs had found their marks. This was not just destruction. It was a statement. America had arrived in the sky over Japan, unannounced and undeniable. By noon, all 16 bombers had completed their runs. The planned attack had been executed with astonishing precision, considering the extreme risks. But the mission was far from over. Fuel was dwindling. The next objective, the escape to China, loomed like another battlefield. Pilots adjusted their headings, knowing the ocean, mountains, and enemy forces lay between them and safety. In Tokyo and other Japanese cities, shock was palpable. Military planners could not comprehend the audacity. Civilian population centers had been violated without warning. The concept of invulnerability, long held by Japan's leaders, was crumbling under the weight of reality. And yet, for the American crews, the mission's most dangerous phase was only beginning. With fuel near exhaustion and enemy forces mobilizing, they faced the vast expanse of China, unknown terrain, uncertain reception, and the risk of capture. The stage was set for the second, desperate half of the raid. Crash landings, rescue operations, and the fury of a nation suddenly aware that its home was no longer untouchable. After striking Japan, the 16 B-25s turned west, aiming for airfields in China. But the mission's planners had anticipated challenges that now became stark realities. Fuel gauges crept toward empty faster than predicted. Strong winds over the East China Sea consumed precious gallons. Mountains and rivers replaced familiar landmarks. For many crews, navigation became a desperate fight against both time and geography. Lieutenant Ted Lawson, leading one of the first bombers over Tokyo, realized that his fuel would not last to the intended airstrip. He signaled the rest of his squadron, and all began searching for emergency landing sites. Some found small fields. Others were forced to descend into rivers or crash into open plains. Each landing was a gamble. Mechanical failure, terrain hazards, and enemy patrols all threatened survival. In rural China, local villagers witnessed the strange aircraft descending from the sky. Many rushed to help the crews, hiding them from Japanese search parties. Yet not all were so fortunate. 8 men were captured by Japanese forces, and 3 were executed later. Several more died in crashes or from injuries sustained during forced landings. Still, the majority survived, carried to safety by Chinese resistance networks despite the enormous risk of Japanese reprisal. Back in Japan, shock rippled through the highest levels of command. The Imperial General Headquarters convened emergency meetings. Questions flew. How had American bombers penetrated so far? How had the carriers approached undetected? The belief that Japan was beyond reach, a sacred geographic shield, was shattered in a single morning. Tokyo's military planners realized that any future attack was possible and that America's industrial and military potential could project power across the Pacific much faster than anticipated. The raid's psychological effect extended far beyond physical damage. Factories continued to operate. Casualties were limited. But the humiliation of vulnerability burned. Japan initiated the Jiangxi campaign in retaliation, causing widespread destruction in Chinese provinces to punish civilians who had aided the Americans. Still, the larger consequence was the strategic awakening. Japanese high command had underestimated both American ingenuity and determination. For the U.S., the success of the raid, despite the near-impossible odds, became a defining moment. Crews who had flown into near-certain death returned with stories that inspired a nation. The American public, hitherto demoralized by months of defeats, now glimpsed proof that Japan could be struck. Morale soared. Military leaders recalculated long-term strategy, recognizing that bold, unconventional strikes could shift the momentum of the war. Doolittle's men had not only delivered bombs to Japanese cities, but had also delivered a message. The United States was far from finished. Every forced landing, every crash, every rescue in China reinforced the audacity and resilience of the American effort. The raid marked the point where the war in the Pacific shifted from reactive to offensive, where Japan's sense of invulnerability eroded, and where America's strategic imagination expanded beyond traditional constraints. The mission concluded, yet its consequences were only beginning. Japan diverted significant forces to homeland defense, stretching already extended supply lines. The raid forced adjustments in naval deployments and accelerated plans for future confrontations, including the decisive Battle of Midway. The Doolittle Raid had been brief, lasting only a matter of hours over Japan, but its reverberations would be felt for months and years, altering the trajectory of the Pacific War. As the dust settled and the surviving crews regrouped, the story moved from the immediacy of action to the consequences of daring, the triumphs, losses, and strategic recalculations that followed. Back in the United States, the Doolittle Raid's impact was immediate and profound. Newspapers splashed headlines announcing that American bombers had struck Tokyo, Yokohama, and other cities. The nation had endured months of shock and retreat. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Wake Island, but now came evidence that Japan was vulnerable. Civilians cheered in streets. Factory floors hummed with renewed energy. The raid, though causing relatively minor physical damage, became a powerful symbol of resilience and ingenuity. President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed the nation in radio broadcasts. While maintaining operational secrecy, he framed the raid as a demonstration that America was striking back. Military recruitment surged. Young men enlisted, inspired by the audacity of 16 bombers flying unescorted over the heart of Japan. The morale boost cannot be overstated. In the darkest months of 1942, Americans finally felt the war could be fought on equal terms, and that victories, however symbolic, were possible. For the crews themselves, the aftermath was a mixture of relief and tragedy. Some landed safely in China, aided by local villagers and resistance networks. Others were captured by Japanese forces. 3 of the raiders were executed, 8 imprisoned, and the remainder eventually repatriated after months of harsh conditions. Doolittle, the mission's leader, had initially feared criticism for the risk involved. Instead, he was awarded the Medal of Honor, and his men received distinguished flying crosses. Their courage became part of the national narrative, embodying the spirit of daring that would define American engagement in the Pacific. Japan's reaction was fierce and immediate. The Imperial High Command could no longer ignore the possibility of attacks on the home islands. In retaliation, they launched the Jiangxi campaign in China, causing widespread devastation and civilian casualties in regions that had assisted the American airmen. This brutal reprisal highlighted both Japan's vulnerability and its capacity for ruthless countermeasures. While the physical damage of the raid was limited, the psychological and strategic consequences for Japan were significant. Their previously secure homeland was exposed, their leadership shaken, and their resources forced into defensive realignment. At the operational level, the raid forced adjustments in Japanese military planning. Coastal defenses were strengthened, early warning systems expanded, and fleet deployments reconsidered. Ships were repositioned to counter the newfound threat of long-range American strikes. The sense of invulnerability that had prevailed since December 1941 was replaced with caution and anxiety. Japan's leadership now understood that America's industrial power, coupled with ingenuity and audacity, could project force directly onto their territory, a revelation that would shape future engagements across the Pacific.